Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fire These Times. I am your host, not Elia Ayoub. So, Elia, if you could introduce yourself, even though everybody probably already knows you.
You were you said you were not gonna introduce yourself as not Elia.
No, I said I'm going to. Okay.
Okay. I'm Elia. Yeah, I'm one of the hosts of Friday's Times. Been doing this since 2020, and we're both very excited to have Larisa on to talk about her amazing book on beekeeping in the end times. Anna, would you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Anna. I'm coming to you from the podcast Obscuristan. And so before we get into the episode, we wanted to mention that both the Fire These Times and Obscuristan are joining the Periphery Media Collective, dedicated to bringing you stories from all the various peripheries of Empire. As our collective gets off the ground, you will start hearing more of our voices in conversation with each other here and on the other podcasts in the collective. So make sure to follow the collective on Patreon at patreon.com/fromtheperiphery, or you can follow us directly on Apple Podcasts if you just search From the Periphery Media, and you can follow the collective there, and you'll be able to see Obscuristan, Politically Depressed, from A Fire These Times, and works that are soon to show up. Okay. And I am most excited to introduce and welcome our guest, Larisa Jašarević, who is an anthropologist and independent researcher. She's a fellow with the Independent Social Research Foundation and a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and the author of Beekeeping in the End Times, which I feel was written personally for me, and I'm very excited to talk about it. So welcome, Larisa.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello.
So yes, I guess we're here to talk about your book, Beekeeping in the End Times. And I guess before we start, I mean, I can introduce the book, but I'm wondering if you could introduce the book to our audience and maybe what you think what it's about, so we can ground ourselves before we start talking about all the many, many themes in it.
All right. So you said I'm an anthropologist. I live in a mountaintop village these days in northeastern Bosnia by the Periphery. It's my father's home village. I basically sort of returned to the land and came back to my paternal village. Let's see. The book has been written on this apiary, and this apiary in this land is sort of the cornerstone of the writing and has been for the many years that the book has been in production. The book really sums up a research project that has been going on since 2014. And the research project concerned honeybees, how they weather climate change and ground effects of climate change that are being felt here around Bosnia, and really discerned by beekeepers in particular. So the book in a nutshell is about learning to spot the ground effects of climate change with focus on honeybees and their appetites for blooming plants, for pollen and for nectar, but also trying to think about the larger context of climate change and everything that entails, sort of the crisis of imagination, the daunting questions about future, kind of meaning of it all, from sort of the different perspective, from the perspective of Islamic eschatology, the tales about death and the end of the world. So that's basically in a nutshell.
I wanted to ask specifically, because here at From the Periphery, we're often finding ourselves talking about the personal and political, but not so often the religious. Well, that's not true. We have been talking about the religious a lot more recently. But I want to be honest that this book for me was a bit of a revelation because it was written from a deeply religious and Islamic perspective, and actually, my family in Armenia also were historically beekeepers, and still, like, some of them keep bees in our village in Armenia. And I read this book while I was by our two hives in my paternal village, sitting with my my aunt who still keeps bees there. And so I was reading this.
I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
Oh yeah, Elia, you sent it to me, and just a month later, I was in Shinoh village in Armenia, and I was sitting by the bees, just reading this book and observing them, and also sort of observing my aunt now, and trying to sort of not trying to seeing various connections, but also having a different perspective on what these creatures that I just have sort of always loved mean for this little village, and also maybe another little village somewhere else. So I was just really deeply moved by that perspective in the book.
Well, it's just amazing that that you were looking at the hives and smelling the hives and watching the bees, and probably hearing your aunt talk about the bees, because beekeepers, they're and they can't stop talking about bees, right, and thinking about them. So put a different spell onto the whole story that you were reading.
Well, yeah, and it was fascinating for me because I'm a bit more religious than this particular part of the family, but Armenia is, generally very religious and very Christian, and there's a very Orthodox Christian church that was just, I could see it from my aunt's house. It's just down the little village road. And it was interesting to hear her talk about the bees and to be reading about the beekeepers in your book talking about the bees, and then hearing your voice speaking about the bees and comparing to just a deeply similar way of how they are addressed. And even my aunt, as I imagine not a particularly religious person, though I'm just getting to know this aunt again and again, so I wouldn't want to speak for her ever. But it was sort of fascinating how, from a completely different perspective, from a completely different place, she spoke in a very similar way about her relationship to her hive. And you mentioned in the very beginning of the book, you talk about when honeybees swarm and the sort of process and the method of preventing them from leaving the hive, and how not just about physically stopping them from leaving. It's also about restoring the connection between the beekeeper and the bees. And this was really fascinating because my aunt got sick over the winter, and she wasn't in the village, and her bees started swarming, and the neighbors came together to try and prevent them from leaving her hive. But later she said, yeah, but I wasn't here. So, their keeper wasn't there. And so many of the bees left because there was no connection restored with me. But I wanted to ask specifically, what inspired you to talk about bees? I know. So were you keeping bees before you started writing this book, or what inspired you to specifically start talking about bees, and climate change? Okay, I'm going to say that again. What specifically inspired you to talk about bees? Because I know you keep bees now, but were you keeping bees before you wrote the book, or was that something that came out of the research that you had been doing?
So let me get to that question, but let's take a few steps backwards, because you said a few really interesting things that I think we should pick up. You started by saying that you were surprised by the story about the end of the world, the climate change, and the honeybees told from, you call it religious perspective or something along those lines, about the fact that you're not, or that only just recently you're talking more about religion. And to me, it's really interesting to kind of highlight what you're saying, because one of the reasons I wrote this book the way I did is because I feel that overall we've been talking so much about politics for all the obvious reasons, right? We have to, but we've been, with all this talk about politics and all the tension about politics, we have sort of overshadowed all other ways of thinking and feeling about the world and things that really matter, including ecology and end times, collective feelings and so forth. So one of the things that I'm trying to do here, hoping, really striving, praying I do it, is to highlight the reverence. Highlight the reverence that, in this case, honeybees really suggest to people across places, across cultures, across religious or a-religious tradition. And to start from that reverence, which then resonates across many different publics, secular, religious, and so forth. But I think also thinking about, highlighting reverence and then ecological undertones, but also unearthing, eschatological undertones of the Islamic tradition. I'm also kind of hoping to, contribute a different tone, a different voice, a different story there for all these many discourses about Islam and religion and so forth, right? And reverence, I think, is also, I think when you said it, so many things about book resonated with you and with your aunt. I think it's no accident. If you pick up books by biologists, bee biologists in particular, these stories, these interjections of awe and admiration and wonder and so forth resonate from one page to another. So there's something very similar to reverence that to be found in writings, in the public science or popular science writings authored by biologists and so forth. And that's something I think that's really precious for us to basically, zoom in on and work with. Precisely because, it opens up the conversations across so many different publics.
Have this sense of reverence before you sought out to start writing about bees? Was that kind of what led you into that?
It was. So I did not keep bees. No one in my family had bees. I didn't have that immediate connection with the beekeeping culture. I was really interested in honey to begin with for various reasons. Honey is treated as medicine here. It is a current object, and not just here, but once again across the cultural traditions, the healing traditions. In many herbalists, world, honey is very prized and cherished, and is attributed to its various medical therapeutic properties. So I was interested in honey. And at the same time, I was interested in Islamic metaphysics. And these two things basically brought me together, or came together and, got me interested in honeybees.
Elia, I wanted to ask you, what is your relationship to bees? Are you, I'm just curious because I've noticed that people have very different, everybody has a reaction to things that buzz around them. And I've noticed that everybody has one, but people's are very different. So are you scared of them? Do you enjoy them from afar? Did you like them as a kid? What kind of reaction do they call upon from you?
Oh, I love them. Half an hour ago, there was a bee that entered the house, and we have a baby, so we're slightly worried or whatever. But I just like bees, so I was very chill. Like, hey, I'm just chatting with the bee. Like, hey, get out, this is not your place, stuff like that. But so I grew up in the mountains of Lebanon, and there were also bees always. And now the population has declined, as is unfortunately across the world, but it's still very common. It's a very common sight. I admit that my initial, or let's say my earliest associations are kind of sad because we used to go to this, I don't know how you would call it in English, like a country club, just like a place that has a pool outside in the mountains, where you pay a membership fee or whatever. And they had a lot of bees because they, were serving food and the bees would come, but they would kill the bees. They would put those traps that have, sweetener inside, and the bees would go inside, but wouldn't know how to go out. And so year after year after year, I just, in my mind, I couldn't not think about them all the time. And there were so many over the years, of course. I grew up every single, when it was hot enough, so spring or summer, whatever, we would go there pretty regularly. I used to swim, so I would take training lessons there. It's the same pool and whatnot. So it was just a very, very common sight for me to see. And a bit, I think early on, I was always into animals. I was vegetarian early on. I had a thing for animals growing up. And it was one of those earliest memories I had of there's something wrong about how humans treat non-humans, basically. It's just this initial thing growing up from very, very early age. Before even I could speak, I think I had this, or at least I remember speaking. I had this association. And then it became a symbol of, the environmental movement in my head. It was this, I think many people were using it already. It's just something that became a symbol in that sense, more than, for example, the polar bear, which I think is big in some circles. But for me, it was just the bees. Like, we have to protect the bees. And it just became, it was this discourse that oftentimes was pretty shallow. And some people were saying this, but without necessarily knowing, like, okay, what do I do with this information? Like, yes, it's bad and they are threatened, but like, what do I do with this information? But it's always been in the back of my mind, if you want. And one of my close friends has like a bee tattoo. It's a thing, it's a thing that a lot of people have. And I like bees. Yeah, I always have. And they don't scare me. I like them.
It's interesting that you say that they're a symbol of the environmental movement, because that's true. Like, save the bees is kind of like a thing that you hear a lot, but I didn't put together until much later that like I had a familial connection to bees I've always liked them, but I didn't put together this sort of like spiritual, environmental, and for me, like ancestral, and also just like natural connection to bees until I think much later in my life, when I actually was able to spend more time in my paternal village and spend a little bit more time around bees themselves. And also find out a little bit more about like the folk tradition associated with these bees, because on the one hand, like, yes, it is like sort of like an ancestral thing that my family did. They kept bees, but also it was during the Soviet Union, so it was very systematized. It was like it was also a science for them, and the business may have even played some role in my great grandfather eventually being sent off and eventually killed on the way to Siberia. So it's sort of like it was both. It was the Soviet Union, so it was an industrial undertaking in some senses. But on the other sense, like if you visit this village and you visit these mountains, there's nothing industrial about it. It's beekeepers, just some of the most beautiful places on earth, trying to figure out how to like maintain this relationship, and each one of them, I think, approaching it in a very different way. In fact, some beekeepers in Armenia, not so much anymore, but a common thing to do would be to, in the summers, you would sort of migrate to a different mountain that would be near your village, and you would take the bees with you, and you would bring them to this mountain where the flowers were more lush, where there was more wildlife and more different sort of pollen for them to be able to collect. And this summer, I actually was also able to visit this, like the mountain to which my family used to migrate for the summer. And it's very close to our village. It's right next to the village, and you have like kind of like an associated place in it. But it was very interesting to go with that aunt on the way up and have her say like, "Oh, this is where the beekeepers usually used to be." And it was fascinating to hear her talk about this. And it was even more fascinating to like be listening to that through the lens of how beekeeping in the end times, and learning a little bit about how that looks in a different place.
Yeah, so I mean, the itinerant beekeeping that you're describing was pretty much the norm for the beekeepers here as well. And the traveling it's much different than what you see in what we're accustomed to think of in relation to industrial beekeeping, kind of the industrial scale, sort of the infamous almond orchard and apple orchard and so forth, and the bees being trucked hundreds of miles from one corner of the country to another. I mean, this is in Bosnia, and I presume Armenia as well, because of the scale of the operations, the scale of the apiaries that are involved, but also the distances that are much shorter. But if you remember, I mean, one part of the story of the beekeeping in the end times is precisely these age-old strategies are no longer working. Started working back in 2014. Beekeepers were basically saying that, you could no longer just have your bees in your backyard and count on the flowers to flow and the honey to flow, but you actually had to move if you wanted to gather any honey. And some who were previously stationary were finding these different nooks to take the bees and to make use of different forage seasons, different altitudes. So the same plant, for instance, has different or used to have different blooming schedules at different altitudes. So they would be using these different altitudes and different microclimates and eco-niches precisely to diversify the forage opportunities for the bees. But basically by 2017 and certainly by 2020, these former differences in climates, in altitudes, really no longer made a difference because the seasons were so altered. Schedules, the nectar secreting schedules and life cycles of the plants were entirely just thrown off the schedule.
Yeah, this is interesting because when we went up to this mountain, my aunt and uncle were sort of lamenting the lack of people, very upset that there were no longer people there, because since since their childhoods, that's the sort of like migration schedule has now fallen away. Nobody really does it anymore. Our meeting used to be called Hilanel, and it's not really something that's done very often. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why, because there used to be very practical reasons for why you would follow this kind of pattern in your own life, why you would follow this migration pattern of leaving your village home for a summer with the children and everybody and the cows and everything down back to the village in the fall. But there were, like you were saying, there were specific plants that you were looking for. There was, you were hoping to that your cows and your pigs would be able to feed off of a different wildlife. And now that's become flattened, but not only by climate change, but also by mining, which has, in Armenia, at least, it's become sort of a big, in this particular region, a mine opened up nearby. And the differences are not immediately visible, but it is interesting hearing beekeepers talk about it because they notice the smallest changes immediately. Which animals are coming closer to the people, which plants are now not as fruitful as they once were. You mentioned in the book that beekeepers in Bosnia would talk about there being seemingly lush fields and no bees swarming around them. And the book opens with, I believe it's a hadith that it opens with, angel asking, if the bees are still swarming. And so that sign of seeing a seemingly a still an equally beautiful sight, but without sort of its core elements, which for beekeepers are bees, but for my aunt who's also a beekeeper, it was also people. It was the same site without people and without bees, and seeing that distinction, knowing that this is a change that is very drastic, though it seems small.
I think you said it. You said beekeepers notice. And this is really important among many nature watchers. I think beekeepers have a very fine, very keen, very delicate sense of the insect's relationship with the plants and plants' relationships with weather, with the elements. And this is why I think they have a very particular grasp on the ground effects of climate change, and why I think it's very important that beekeepers are part of the story about the climate change effects that we are actually talking about. And when we say we, I think we're all contributing to that story one way or another. It's an open question what climate change effects entail, what kinds of world alterations that entails. It's something that we're only just discovering. When I say we, once again, I mean all of us who are paying attention, but also the scientists who are in the business of actually noticing. And now the things are happening so rapidly and across so many different fronts. Their task of observing is becoming that much more difficult, which is why, once again, participants, those who have their hands on the different species, like beekeepers, have hands on the insects and are keenly observing the bees, that really have something important to say and contribute to the story of climate change that that is unspooling.
So you open the book following, I think, your neighbor, who you say is a traditional beekeeper, distinguished from modern beekeeping as following certain practices that would have been like folk practices that would have been traditional to her. But you also mentioned that these are informed by Islam, and that though these beekeepers aren't necessarily studying Islam and learning, it's not a field of study for them. They're practicing it almost as a form of oral tradition. And this is also much closer to how I've experienced Armenian Orthodox Christianity. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe the significance of that spiritual connection, and how that informs their beekeeping and their relationship to these hives for which they are caretakers and custodians.
So the book actually opens up with it's not a hadith, it's a story about angels. Should I tell me?
Yes, you should. I was hoping, yes, please do. And I'm sorry for misnaming it earlier.
No, you're bringing me back to two stories that are starting the book. One is about the angels, and the other one is about a swarming event by the traditional beekeeper.
Yes.
For the sake of those who haven't seen the book opens up with a story that is not a hadith, but is a folk story which very much leans on the Islamic eschatological tradition in vernacular terms, in folk terms, to retell the whole lore. And to sum up the reverence about the bees, and to kind of reference the Islamic tradition without necessarily, citing the hadith in the Quran and so forth. But it's a very telling story. So the story goes like this. Every 100 years, two angels open up their eyes and they ask, are the bees still swarming? And their fellow angels, those who keep a watchful eye on the world, they say, the bees are still swarming. What about the sheep? The two angels ask. Are they still lambing? And the fellow angels look at the world and they say, oh yeah, the sheep are still lambing. What about the fish? The two angels ask. And the fellow angels reply, the fish are still spawning. Well then, the two angels say, the end is not yet. And they close their eyes for another spell of silent meditation. And so this is a story that is retold by beekeepers and by many nature lovers and bee lovers across Bosnia. And usually the story is told especially when there is a catastrophic event of sorts. At whichever scale. So somebody's bees collapsed or have been killed by pesticides that someone has sprayed on the nearby field. Or they would hear something about bees doing well, bees doing poorly when there were mass deaths reported from North Europe and from the United States. These stories on the ground would be retold. And then in light of catastrophic weather events, these stories are being retold. And it's really powerful stories. Not least because they're teaching us about, the core kind of assumptions that the world's end is coming. It's looming. It is not being mentioned in the angels' exchanges is actually the human species is actually being culpable. It's only the human species who could possibly be at fault for these species not doing so well. But it's also, teaching the care for the non-human species. And it's teaching about responsibility, reminding us of responsibility, and reminding sort of that the delicate balance and the fate of the world hinges on the well-being, the welfare of the animals, and implicitly by humans living up to their responsibility of treating the other species well.
This is, I think, a perfect transition, because I actually wanted to talk about that humans and other species and what our responsibility is. But specifically, I think among the left, I think after the 90s, there was this big shift from sentimental environmentalism to a sort of like practical human-centric prediction of disaster. This like, well, this is how many people are going to be displaced by climate change. These are the effects on people. These are the economic consequences of it, which I think certainly are all true and important. And I also think it wasn't a completely meritless switch, because European sentimentalist view of nature and land as empty and undertouched was something that underpinned American colonization and also so much of colonization from the West in general. This idea of like beautiful landscapes without people. But now today, when we, I think there's been like a little bit of a pendulum swing back, as that sort of sentimental attitude towards nature creeping back into left spaces, which is good. But now when we ask people to access their connection to land, it's usually tangential in some way. You'll hear a lot of like indigenous beliefs invoked sort of vaguely. But there has been like a real loss, I think, in how to conceive of land and love for land without invoking that pure like sentimentality or strict practicality, or leaning on traditions that are significant, but like not always your own or our own. And the book, I think, was a really unique against those choices. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and about like what bees and what this relationship to bees, and what specifically the Islamic perspective that you were talking about in the book can offer us in terms of connecting to land and seeing our place in it, without relying on either sentimentality or sort of soulless practicality, or a tradition that may be far away from us and not ours to claim.
Thank you so much. This is really a wonderful question. And I'm kind of thinking about several things. I'm thinking about kind of the deep, gut deep unease that was describing when he remembers being a boy and seeing all these bees being caught in food traps, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think gut level unease, visceral kind of reaction, which is not disconnected from love, right? And a sense of fairness and a sense of responsibility and so forth. I think that's something that we ought to tap into. Again, who is we? I'm presuming that our listeners right now are, nature lovers, or at least deeply concerned about what's happening now and the atmosphere and the biosphere and so forth. So when I say we, I mean the sympathetic listeners, and then the two of you, my fellows right now on the show. So I think that kind of the visceral, what is that? The resource that we have of empathy and care and love is something that we ought to be dipping in. And I think environmentalists are dipping in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
You're quite right. The stories that are available out there now, and especially among the academics who are eco-minded and who are really trying to rethink our relationship with the non-humans and with many different species now, in the light of a sort of the disenchantment with many, if not all, things modern, including our anthropocentric ideologies,
Mm-hmm.
Stories about the human non-human relationships. Many academics these days are now searching for these other stories, other ways of retelling these connections and recuperating these gut feelings, or recuperating some ideals or aspirations that we could be cultivating, but that we could also, be inspired by, and it could also oil our imagination so that we, hopefully do things differently and scramble for ways through this disaster, the climate disaster. And so, I'm kind of part of the academics who are part of this way, trying to figure out ways out through storytelling, among other things. And so for me, given that I was working with Muslim Muslims, but also that I was working very closely with Sufi sheikhs here and imams, many of the beekeepers are actually imams, it was inevitable to tap into the whole Islamic and Muslim lore that surrounds honeybees in particular, but nature in general. And, as I was thinking through the honeybees and thinking through the climate disaster, which locals here are, local Muslims and beekeepers who are deeply concerned are also describing as the Akhir Zaman, the end times, the final times. In order to take these stories seriously, I was, digging through and listening very carefully to the Muslim story. Unearthing the cosmology, Islamic cosmology, and unearthing really the whole treasure house of Islamic eschatology, which surprisingly is full of ecological undertones, which are not appreciated enough precisely because too often we gloss all these things with political kind of balances, and then we miss so much of what's there for imagination or inspiration, but also for values that are not far from practice, that we actually need values, we need sentiments, we need feelings to make our practices viable, but also to, figure out our practices.
Can I add a few things? I have so many thoughts. As you two were talking, I remember I mentioned earlier that I've been a vegetarian for a long time, and actually the early on, so when I think I was 14 or 15 or so, I really got into Christian mysticism, and specifically folks like Francis Assisi, who was a big figure in Lebanese Catholicism, especially. But also like folks like Leo Tolstoy, the Kingdom of God is Within You was just one of the texts that was in the house and stuff like that. And I, in retrospect, have always associated, for example, certain monasteries around where I grew up with, among the few people that right now I would describe as among the few people who were not living in this, I don't know how you would call it, but this, of course, they were living in capitalism because everyone is in many ways, but they also had a distance from it based on certain practices that they were practicing every single day, among the main ones were, caring for the non-human, caring for, or the more than human, as I've been preferring to use more recently. And this among those were the beekeepers. But I'm thinking about it now, and you mentioned stories, and by far, I used to watch a lot of documentaries. David Attenborough, I had all of the DVDs and all of that stuff, and they were effective to a certain extent. But I think one thing, and I reflected on this in an episode with Margaret Killjoy and Aiden, who's one of the other co-hosts, about 7 months ago, because the title of that episode was like "How to Live Like the World is Dying." And that was one of the titles that Margaret herself uses, and it's like a website and a podcast and whatnot, which I recommend. Specifically because there was that contrast. Like, it's not just acknowledging that the world is dying in that sense, but like specifically how to live as if you know this, but you still want to live, right? It's like going against the grain in many ways. And the stories that I grew up with, some of which were like, let's say oral traditions, other were like just children's book, others like movies or animated series. The Ghibli movies were very big, at least for me growing up, because they also had that element to them. Princess Mononoke was a huge thing for me. Impacted me. It is very good. Impacted me in a way that, again, not to necessarily compare, but I would say like it added something to my relationship, how I was feeling towards, let's say, nature or the more than human, that the documentaries that here I'm using as an example, David Attenborough's documentaries, couldn't do in the same way, because they were for the most part devoid of those stories. It was like, this is what was happening, these are the animals, this is how they made, and which has some story element to it. I'm not dismissing that, but often I think about it this way: there was like a box set, and then the last DVD is always about, well, these are all of the lovely things, the first 9 chapters, and here's how we are destroying everything. And this is the last chapter, right? And it's sort of like what you would actually, this is the thing that you have to take away from this story, this DVD, right? Or this documentary. And I think at some point I consumed so much of it that I just couldn't take it anymore. Because again, it's the same thing of like, it's not that it's not that having too much information in and of itself was the problem, is that it was often not combined, if you want, or, there was something missing. And I think something that's missing is this, what we were describing is like sentimentality, emotions, the stories, and so on. And later, and I mentioned this in the episode with Margaret, that I had lots of difficulties, for example, even going on hikes, because I would have these associations in my mind of like, oh, well, this is going, this is being destroyed, this is dying. And I was like, the more I would go out in nature, the more I had these associations, even though around me physically, it's not that it wasn't happening, but it wasn't like the main thing happening. So I was missing the bees. I was missing, I was not paying attention, missing the forest for the trees, to say. Good metaphor here. And what got me back into thinking about, or like feeling rather, because thinking was never the problem, it was feeling that was the problem. I was preventing myself from feeling because it was so difficult. But was reading certain, again, stories, especially indigenous stories, or stories that I kind of got more attached to. And this, you mentioned, Anna, earlier, the kind of, let's call it Euro-American, Western, whatever, way of treating nature, which was often like, nature is over there, and the more there is us. So like the way to do conservation is to reduce the us, reduce the human element of it, because the only thing we're good at is destroying nature. And there was very much this sense that I also had that growing up, and I think that in retrospect, what created that severance between myself and nature, if you want. And the indigenous stories are the ones that, for me, when I learned especially of the role of the indigenous folks in the Amazon rainforest, because I went there about over a decade ago now, that their view of themselves were not cynical, despite the fact that they were in many ways, the frontline defenders, and still are in many ways. But they still had a worldview, stories, mythology, religion, whatever, that gave them sort of a vocabulary to deal with the end times without losing hope, if that makes sense. And in many ways, it's because they have already dealt with the end times in the past. At least one of the explanations I saw for that, the arrival of Western colonization, and so on. And so it wasn't in and of itself something new. And their relationship with the land is not like the more humans there are here, the more the land suffers, but there is actually some kind of complementarity between the two. And that we can actually help the land in the same way that the land can help us. And that's kind of is what, among other things, what kind of shifted my perspective on this, if that makes sense.
I hear you. And I think what I would translate what you just said into a term that I coined and I'm really fond of. You as well, something I called eco-eschatology. The book is basically propounding or suggesting, recommending eco-eschatology as a sort of a stance. It's an affective stance. It's an involvement with the world that is ecologically minded, but has eschatology as kind of the overall framework within which we're each one of us, deeply implicated. So it's not just nature dying, it's death that is really our lot of all the things. We all are finite, no getting away with it, which is why in Islamic tradition it's very helpful, I think, and it's quite deliberate in the Quran and the Hadith, that the death and the end of the world are always paired together for various reasons, but the least of which is perhaps to keep reminding ourselves that we are finite, right? And that, but with the humans, it's very, very particular. With Islamic perspective, the solution is never to get rid of humans. It's not the anthro decentering in that sort of a sense, but it's recentering the human, and very definition of human and meaning of human around the question of accountability. The reason to keep your own death in mind is because it comes with living comes with great stakes. You're supposed to do something really good with your life. You're supposed not to blow your chances. Life is super precious. Life in general, God's name is Hay, life, and so the Sufis are invoking Hai, 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 right? So life, God is life. One of divine's names is life. And then we're all part of what life is precious, it's divine, it's blessing. But it's precious if you make use of it. And, that kind of reminder, being eschatological is reminding yourself of your own finitude. Never know, the end is looming, death is looming. And the whole point is to prepare for it. And that preparedness is something I call eschatological activism. With that kind of your own end in sight, you're striving to do the best you possibly can to contribute to the world, which is absolutely precious and which is your connection to the meaning of life. Connection to life and the point of nurturing life is the connection to the meaning that gives meaning to the life. So I don't know but I try to relate to what you were telling me.
You did. Thanks for that. I struggled to find the words to describe those emotions, let's say, but I'm gonna use that from now on.
I like the terms that Larisa, you're bringing up here, because they, to me, feel how I experience both God and also the world around me, and also human beings. And I think there's value in understanding that, life being precious comes with both responsibility and also deep meaning. That like the finite nature of it gives it meaning, but also gives us responsibility in like doing something with that time. But Elia, mentioning earlier that the churches that were around you were sort of the single places that you saw as being maybe outside of a system that you well, I shouldn't say the churches, maybe the people around the churches that you saw.
Yeah, specifically a couple of monasteries I have in mind. I don't know. I wouldn't make the claim it was like all of them necessarily.
Yeah.
Some of them I wouldn't like. There's corruption in Lebanon,
That's exactly. Yeah, I was trying to carefully.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but for me, I didn't grow up particularly religious, but I chose to get baptized and become I became much more religious, and I became much more faithful, I think, after spending significant amounts of time in Armenian monasteries in Armenia. And all of them are built, basically all of them are built deeply connected to the natural world around them. The one that everybody visits when they come is monastery, and it's literally built into the stone. It's carved almost into the stone of the mountain that it is on. And the others are, similarly situated. They're built on the edges of cliffs, in really high places. They're always sort of very connected to the land that they are on. But I don't think that's, I think similarly to how you're describing Sufism and the relationship between the spiritual, the folk, and the practical. Most Armenian tradition also grants like really special places to the world around us, but it also recognizes our place in that natural world. For example, I'm sitting in front of an Armenian rug right now, but a very, very common symbol that's like used in Armenian. But when you have bees on Armenian rugs, you always have to surround them with symbols of flowers, because you can't leave the bees with nothing to feed off of. And you will see bees and people and donkeys, and they exist together. And rugs were a form of folk art; they were a form of folk memory. But you can see the significance of what these you can see the of these elements, but they have to exist in harmony together. And now rugs are made, and you can see like these symbols are disjointed, but even still, I was shopping for rugs recently, which is why I bring it up. But I was trying to find a rug with bees on it, and immediately I saw them, and I noticed that tradition had been preserved. That if there was a rug with bees on it, and the hives were portrayed in the rug, it was always the border was flowers. It has to be surrounded by flowers because they have to have somewhere to go. But I was very moved by, Joey, what you were saying about how, indigenous, like the indigenous culture's view of that natural world. And that was the first thing I noticed with my aunt coming to this mountain. And for her, the great sadness, it wasn't just that, she was so angry about the mine, which has been there for a while now, but she was so angry about it. But I think even more, she even said it, she was very, very sad that there were no people on the mountain. She was deeply hurt and upset that there were no people in a mountain that as filled with communities. And that, I think, was the thing that made her the most upset. It was like that story of destruction, or the end times. It was she was a part of it. Her community was a part of it. Her family, her village, they were all a part of it. And their absence was felt as much as the absence of certain plants. And it was felt as much as the absence of the bees swarming. She was seeing that very acutely because to her, this is a part of the same. Yeah.
If I can add, just because you mentioned the rocks, the monastery is built in rocks, and one of the most beautiful ones in Lebanon is also that. It's in Qadisha Valley, where Khalil Gibran is from, actually, or nearby where he's from, where he grew up, and it's in one of his poems. I forgot which one right now. It's where I was doing a tour with a few friends of mine, and we're going through a bunch of different monasteries because two of them. So one of them is where the first Arabic printing press was in I don't know, the world. I think in the world or in the Middle East in any case. And the second one is where the first Syriac press was. And it was interesting to see both of those in monasteries. Both of those happened in monasteries. And in one of I believe it was a Syriac one. It could be the Arabic one or the Syriac one. I think it was the Syriac one. One of the stories that the Abuna, like the priest, was telling us was that. So it's a story that's inscribed basically in one of the books that they printed on, and it was a story about bees. And now I wish I remembered it. I wish I had it somewhere. I don't. I just remembered him talking about it at the time. So I'll see if I can find it, or it'd be nice to add it as an addendum. But yeah, it came to mind.
It's beautiful, and you make me think of a couple of things. This also goes back to Anna's earlier point. And I think there is something to be said, there's much to be said about recuperating the lore, cosmologies, stories from the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam in particular, precisely because there's much disenchantment going there, and because also there is, for various reasons, they aren't being paid attention to when it comes to ecology, not enough. And there's also common sense, a sort of a disgruntlement among the environmentalists, particularly when it comes to Christianity. There are many that have, for good reasons, also connected Christianity and missionarism, colonialism, and so on and so forth. So there is a good reason for certain kind of skepticism and caution and so forth. But, that's not the reason to, discard the monotheistic religions and traditions entirely, especially now as we are trying to reinvigorate, or ought to be reinvigorating, our relationship with the meaning of nature, right? And also, not least, because I think we really need faith. There's so much discourses about hope connected to environmentalism, environmental disasters and climate disaster and so forth. But, hope is on very thin grounds, on speculative philosophical grounds, without faith in the picture. And it often does actually imply some sort of a faith, and with all kinds of metaphysical assumptions that are rarely put on the table. But faith, I think, is essential to keeping hope, and therefore, practicing good things, ecologically sound things, and once again scrambling our ways out of disaster, even though the skies are nearly falling, and at least the stable climate is now nearly extinct.
Sorry.
To say this, so beautiful about the rugs, and I see the rug behind you. I love it.
Thank you.
I almost can see reading those. So it's red, and there are two black and two white patches. They remind me of bee queens.
Yes.
But in any case, it's so it's a beautiful in what you're describing. The folk common sense, the folk ecological common sense that bees hinge on flowers. And if you were looking further at these rugs, I wonder if you would see even more kind of assumptions about the elements, the air, the earth, the sky, the water, and so forth. And it's woven into the fabric, it's woven into the pattern, but it's really common sense ecological kind of notion of what the things that are inseparable.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, if we're talking not to derail fully on rugs, but I was at an Artsakh rug museum of rugs that had been rescued from Artsakh under bombardment back in 2020. And many of this is where I learned about a lot of the bee symbolism that is found on rugs. And those were specifically rugs from Shushi and from Artsakh. But one of the fascinating things is that, the rugs included symbolism of bees and motherhood and the natural world, but on many of the same rugs, you would also, or even sometimes it'd be rugs hanging next to them, but again, like the symbols were interwoven together, you would have portrayals of heaven and hell, of the, like, they would be right next to religious symbolism, because Armenian rugs are all, or Armenian symbolism is deeply Christian. You would find crosses that are woven into rosettes, so flowers, and for the people practicing this religion and for the people creating these rugs, and many of whom were probably themselves either keeping bees or surrounded by those who keep bees, or at least like they were thinking about this because they put it in the same rug. They put it in one place. And so I don't believe that these things are random symbols or that just put because they look pretty. Because if you look at these rugs, you can, Armenian rug experts or, hobbyists will talk about reading a rug. We'll talk about understanding it. And there's deep meaning behind how these symbols are put together. And the fact that the religious, the Christian, the idea of salvation was placed right next to the natural world, the very practical, the donkeys that carry your water, the bees that give you fruit, and the people that are then, among all of these other creatures. So you would see all of that symbolism usually in either in one rug or woven together in different rugs next to each other. And there's just so much to, I think, gain from just trying to read them and learning from them. But I really think that there's a lot of folk knowledge that's kind of contained in these forms of folk art. And not just rugs, there were dolls. I mean, there were so many different things that each of them carry such deep meaning, I think. But I did want to maybe transition because you mentioned faith, and this is the perfect transition because I ultimately wanted to talk about the sort of bigger picture of your book, because it is ultimately a book about prophecy and about the end of the world. And there's this constant conversation among leftists of how to talk about climate without quote unquote burning out. And it's a really weird conversation because it actually echoes a right-wing talking that I think, unfortunately, was most popularly articulated by Jordan Peterson in one of his many deranged rants. But he said that, something basically the radical left is depressing the shit out of teenagers by telling them about climate change and that the world is ending, and that, somehow the responsibility of depression or, of ailing mental health among young people today is on the left for talking and for emphasizing climate change. But it mirrors that I have very frequently in circles in the left about how we talk about climate change, how to engage with it without burning out. And that's fascinating to me because, you in your book, and I think in this conversation, we've seen that the monotheistic religions and many others, but specifically, since we're here, we're talking about them, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all explicitly conceive of an end times. They all talk about an end times. And so I'm wondering how you think we should be thinking about the end times and talking about it. And what role faith plays in that, what role faith plays in talking about the end times. Not the least of the reasons why we should be talking about this is because I think the end times has been so cynically weaponized by many Christian communities in the US, at least, to be a thing that's like used as a cudgel with which to beat people rather than like an intricate part of faith. So I really wanted to put this question to you because this is ultimately what your book is leading to.
So thank you for that. But believe it or not, after all these years, it's not an easy question for me. We all did. My sister Azra and I have made a film by the same title, and which is to say that we spent much or many years and much time into thinking through this and telling many different stories and across different media. And yet it's never an easy question and partly I think this is partly an answer to your question. It's hard for me to even think about burning out on the subject if you take it that seriously, right? And so, I'm thinking about a couple of things. So I'll just throw them out there and try and the loose ends. First of all, climate change. When you are, I wish we can all. I keep invoking this we once again, hoping that there are sympathetic and listeners out there aside the two of you. If we could, keep reaching out and staying in touch with the world out there, with that rock, with or without a monastery on it, with a patch of land, with thickets, with that bee that wanders into our house, and so on and so forth, whatever it takes. And if nothing else, I think the wrecked climate is staging so many different events that are, whether we like it or not, that are going to be putting us in touch with deranged elements. And so we'll have that kind of exposure, but I also think we should be seeking those kinds of exposure in order to stay in touch and stay tuned and stay watchful for the dear world going to ruin. It's not necessarily dying, but really reinventing radically, inventively, its relationships with everything. So multi-species, many species are now reinventing their relationships with one another and with the elements and so forth. So everything is being resorted right now. And so just staying in touch that, knowing that everything we hold dear hinges on that is really important. And that's one short way not to burn out. That's how it is for the beekeepers. There's no burning out. Every single season now and day to day are staging unexpected surprises, and they got their bees take care of. And so there's constantly on the toes, and you hang on to something that you love dearly and you do your best. Sometimes you get tired, but you don't burn out. You just keep at it because it's the thing that you hold the dearest, and it keeps fueling you. Think about war. Think about emergency situations. That's how it feels. I also mentioned this. I live now in the mountaintop village, and it's very good for me also because I'm with my bees. They keep me watchful, but also because here I feel more exposed to the other elements that I would have been in a city. And one thing, for instance, that happened this summer is a new pattern for the heat waves. Now they're starting much earlier. They started now early July and are lasting much longer. We're second year into the drought. This has all kinds of implications for bees, forests, and the flowers. But what's new is that the water wells have dried up. And so basically now we're getting water coming through the village pipeline every second day for about 15 minutes. because we haven't had the rain until a few days ago for a very long time, second year of a drought. And so part of my daily schedule now is to go fetch water, to go seek out waters now on the mountain, on the water wells that have not yet dried out. We had 3 wells on our land, and pretty much all of them have dried out. So, this is just one way in which, all of this is, things have been happening with my bees, and this is another story, but also, it's coming closer even home because, the basic thing, water, I can no longer count on it just, coming through my faucet. So these are the ways, this is anecdotal, obviously, but this is a way to stay tuned to the emergency, to feel that it's real. Now, with Islamic perspective that, sort of I appreciate for many different reasons, does not allow for hopelessness. There's no such thing there. Only the Quran says that only the kafirun, lose faith in the mercy and gentleness of the nurturer. Lord is translated as nurturer as well. So only those without faith and kafir is the one who covers up, who occludes something. In this case, occludes God's infinite gentleness, mercy, wisdom, and so forth. So, it only takes kind of occluding or minimizing, diminishing the possibilities that come from the source of all possibilities in order to lose hope. So the faith is, antidote to hopelessness, to despair, to depression.
This makes me think of one thing. A quick sidetrack, but it's related to this because me and my partner, we've been thinking a lot of like where should we live. Neither of us are where we're from, and currently like where we're from, and where we're moving is neither that either. We're not from the place that we're moving to, but the place that we're moving to, we have more communities there. We know more people there, and so we went through this back and forth of like, what do we do if, of course, with global warming, with security, with all of that stuff. And the place where we're currently at is like, it's a rich place, rich country and whatnot, but they kind of, for me and for us in any case, there's a lack of community. And what concerns us, and kind of one of the many reasons why we made that decision to move to this other place, which in some senses has, or at least the perception that we have is that it has less stability than the place that we're currently at, is that the place where we're currently at, when, to use this expression, shit hits the fan, when things get really bad, we are just dependent on what the responses are on the top bottom. So like what the state decides to do, whether there are resources or not, and in terms of our own participation in it is very minimal. We don't feel like we have much agency. We're not citizens, among other many reasons. Whereas the place where we're going, despite the fact that we're not citizens of that place either, we know many other people who have either similar backgrounds, not necessarily like they come from the same places, but like they're also, let's say, migrants. They've experienced precarity. They've been thinking of the world in a different sense than just the way I picture it anyway, of like, a lot of people around us here have had a certain type of stability that I would describe as unhealthy. Not stability itself being unhealthy, but the type of stability here specifically is unhealthy because it depends a lot of when you have these what is perceived as external events. So a drought, a storm that's really bad or whatnot. It makes the news. It's might scare some folks here and there. But then almost as quickly as it came, it's forgotten. The next day it's forgotten. Because, and this reminds me, I'll end on this, reminds me there was a very bad flooding that happened in Germany like 2 or 3 years ago. And I remember this very well. I mentioned this on this podcast as well a few times, one of the women who was affected, she lost her home or something, and she's an elderly woman. She said this line of like, you don't expect these things to happen here. You expect them to happen over there, whatever the over there means, right? And there's a lot of that. It feels almost sentimental, or rather almost emotional, in the sense of like the inside of the house is protected, and we are these, cubicles and units, and we interact with one another almost like in this transactional way. Whereas what we're seeking, if you're more of a community, it's more fluid in many ways, and also maybe paradoxically, I don't know, it's more stable because it doesn't take stability for granted. Is how I would put it. And that remind me a bit the way you were talking, like being in many ways more on the front line, like you see it faster. The important detail there, I feel, is not that the others won't get to see it, is that they may see it later. It may not filter in their consciousness, let's say, as fast, maybe. Maybe they'll have other emotional or whatever mental processes that filter these thoughts of the end of the world or end times or the apocalypse or global warming or whatnot, like, oh, this is a tomorrow problem or what have you. And I feel like overall, although in the moment it feels like a good defense mechanism to not freak out or whatever, but overall it makes us less actually capable of dealing with reality at all, like in the first place, let alone in global warming, with global warming and whatnot. So you just added these reflections. I didn't mean to cut you off, Anna.
You didn't.
Oh, good.
It's a sense of immunity, right? When you talk about it gives a sense of immunity, and really, no one is immune to global climate change. I mean, I think it's a perception that the nation states that are affluent and have all kinds of technologies to prepare better for the crises and so forth. But all of these resources are actually limited when it comes to the inventiveness that is being staged now through the global climate change. So I think that sense of immunity is false, and it's probably part of the reason why there is so little of climate action that actually makes, or that has made, the difference, and that has shifted our course when there was still a time to meet the timelines and to curb the emissions and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think that sense of immunity is also deeply related to depression that Anna, you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Things that concerns me the most when I visit my family is the disconnection from self, in that there's been a path placed before people, and I think especially this applies to former Soviet states, where progress and development are equated to a certain way of living and being. And so I have noticed a lack of it's not growing, but a sort of progressive lack of interest in in ways of being that have predated us, or predated like myself. So for example, I didn't know that my family had this like migratory pattern that we followed for, I don't even know how long. They'd been living in the same village since the 1700s at least. So for possibly that long, they'd probably been living in that village and migrating up to that mountain seasons, in order to not just survive, but thrive, in order to, live with the land that they were given. And I don't necessarily, I don't mean for this to be a sort of sentimentalist or like backward looking idea of like, well, even though as much as Larisa, when you said that you had moved back to your paternal village, I mean, that's my dream. I would like to move back to this very same village and just keep peace and live there. But as much as it's my dream. It is a thing that I imagine would bring me a sense of joy and peace. But I don't know that everybody needs to want that or needs to, see that in order to have a sense of what it means to be a person up in the world, in order to have a sense of what it means to be a human being on and of the earth. And but what concerns me is that lack of interest in that. And it's not because I think that everybody should be interested in the same things. It's because I think that there's been nothing offered to replace it, or nothing offered to foster a connection to the land that probably will look different 10 years from now than it does today, and look 10 years ago and 100 years before that. I'm not suggesting that things should stay the same. But absent something else, absent an offering of connection to land that is more than just, I really enjoy hiking, because much of my family enjoys, and that's important, but something that's beyond just, and we are here. Absent that path, I am concerned. And it's for those reasons that I think I end up looking backwards and looking, to ancestral ways of being or traditional ways of being, not because I think they're the only ways of being or the Platonic ideal of how we should be, but because sometimes I don't know where else to look. And I wonder what we could offer people that isn't only that, because I'm lucky. I'm very lucky that I'm able to walk to my paternal village and know that, and learn things about it. I'm not so lucky on my maternal village. I can't set foot in it. But most people understandably don't have that for many, many different reasons. But I would hope that we still are able to live in a world where they can be connected to land and to, the environment that nurtures them without having to look to that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, we moderns tend to look with certain arrogance at traditions of all sorts. And I think we can no longer afford that arrogance, to discard the traditions for all kinds of reasons. And going back to your rugs, there's something precious and deeply ecological about, once again, the common sense that was woven in thread by thread and passed on through carpet stories. And so there is so much about traditions that I think is worth revisiting, and also worth learning from as we're trying to reinvent our ways onwards. It's not necessarily that we're going to, even though, once again, the climate change is staging so many surprises that it's very difficult to tell what kinds of ways we'll be figuring out through the trouble. But certainly, we ought to be thinking back and thinking with the traditions that have registered and passed on something about the deep knowledge about these relationships. So I'm also thinking about bees right now, and this is a side point. The beekeepers now, they've got this thick lore on the microclimates, niches, and the preferences of different plants for moisture, temperature, soil qualities, and so forth, and preferences of insects for the wind types, and so on and so forth. And all this lore is super rich, very important, very telling, but at the same time, now it's almost outdated and misplaced because things are happening. And yet this is these are the traditions that we ought to be salvaging, if nothing else, at least for the sake of knowing the intricate matrix of things that we are actually now, that is being unraveled and that we're losing. You called it also, you said something along the lines of on and off the earth, so that we know that we are on, that we belong on, and that we are off the earth. Something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is really also vital for the urban populations. Precisely, that's what you're saying. We once again, we on board. Jump on the board with me. I'm invoking the precious many ways, the traditional, but also yet to be invented, of connecting our urban populations, and many of them eagerly urban populations.
Mm-hmm.
The many facts in which we are on and off Earth. Because I think that is also absolutely vital to weathering the trouble, and first of all, really waking to the fact that this is a big deal. No one is immune. And it's not the lost battle. We don't throw our hands up in the air. It's not the lost battle. It is the battle that calls all of us to join in and first of all start noticing and then start caring and, for God's sake, weeping, but also rejoicing at the opportunity to step up, and boost and do our share.
I was going to ask if you had any final words for our listeners, but I'm not sure I could ask you to come up with anything more beautiful than what you just said. But if you do have any final parting words to share, okay, then my impression was correct. Larisa, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure and honor, and honestly, just a joy to talk to you and get to talk about the amazing book that you wrote. So please, for our listeners, get a copy of Beekeeping in the End Times. You will not regret it. And I hope that you can get even a fraction of what I got out of this book, because it really was such a joy to read. So yeah. Elia, would you like to sign us off?
There's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish that just, the sentence that is at least the most often cited one is على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة. So on this earth is what makes life worth living, basically. And then the poem continues. I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes for listeners with the translation. Basically goes on to list the things that makes life worth living, at least for Mahmoud Darwish. The scent of bread and the morning recite, something along those lines. And I feel like it's a good encapsulation of this conversation. And in case not to summarize it all by one sentence, of course. But I just wanted to add that. Larisa, thanks a lot for doing this. Honestly, I know Anna, as Anna just mentioned, this was very precious, and I do know listeners will agree. And I look forward to their feedback and comments and whatnot. I'll be happy to share them along as well, and we'll put all of the links of the relevant things that we've mentioned in the show notes as well. But yeah, thank you for being here, Anna.
Larisa, where can our listeners find you, and where can they follow your work?
Thank you. Well, first of all, it was my pleasure chatting with you. I hope this is not the last time we meet.
We hope so too.
My sister and I have a website. Anyone is interested in seeing some photographs from our field sites and from our land, learning a little more about the book, which is also, by the way, available, I should say, as it's in public domain. I don't know if I have the link up there, but you can read it for free also if you'd like, or at least browse it, or ignore it. Feel free to ignore it. Photograph, really beautiful, and we have some videos. And it's also a website for our film by the same name, and it's easy. It's www.beekeepinginthetimes.com, and my email address is there. So if anyone has to get in touch, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Larisa, for being here. As always, find more from us on patreon.com/From the Periphery, or directly on Apple Podcasts if you find the From the Periphery Media Collective. And yeah, thank you for listening to The Fire of These Times.